Every year, more and more brave climbers take on the challenge of Everest, the world's highest mountain. Many use the help of Sherpas, local guides who help the tourists to carry their things and navigate the way up. Most of the courageous hikers use oxygen tanks to compensate for the thin air at high altitude, while some decide to go without any help at all, just like in the good old days. There is one thing, however, that all of the people who reach the planet's highest point almost always share in common. They come down the same way they went up, on their feet. In 2001, the 22-year-old Marco Siffredi decided to do things a little differently. He would climb up in the traditional way, but on the way down, he would snowboard. And as you know by now, this story wouldn't be on this channel if he'd gotten down safely. George Mallory, one of the first people to reach Everest's peak, although it wasn't his fate to come down again, gave an interview shortly before making the ascent. When asked why he wanted to climb it, he replied, "Because it's there." Perhaps this short phrase best sums up the feelings of many climbers who dream of standing on top of the world. Today, climbing Everest is quite commercialized. For a few tens of thousands of dollars, you can reach the summit quite safely. However, casualties on Everest slopes do still happen quite frequently. The frozen bodies of dead climbers become nothing but useful landmarks to help others navigate to the top. This section of the route is known as Rainbow Valley because of the colorful clothes of the deceased poking out from under the snow. Charming. The journey up Mount Everest can be long and exhausting, but that's only the half of it. Getting down again safe and sound is just as important. The Siffredis were a close-knit family. Philip and Michelle met as teenagers. Michelle was from quite a wealthy family, while Philip was the son of a mountain guide. Philip's father asked him to choose a more normal profession. Being a guide was dangerous and didn't bring in a lot of money either. So the young man went with his wife to Paris to study hairdressing and found that the work suited him. However, the couple's love for climbing never disappeared. In their free time, they would rush for the mountains where Philip worked part-time as a guide and Michelle, a secretary in her day job, as a ski coach. Chamonix, where the Siffredis lived, is considered the birthplace of mountaineering, and in 1924, the first Winter Olympics were held there. No wonder that the history of almost every family there is tied up with the mountains in some way. The Siffredi family was no exception. Everyone was a big lover of mountain tourism. And yet, in Chamonix, at the foot of the mountains, there is a small cemetery where the ill-fated climbers of the local peaks find their last refuge. It can come as a shock to read the dates on the gravestones. Many of the people buried here were not even 40 years old. Such, however, is the price of loving the mountains, and the inhabitants of Chamonix have always understood this. Living in the mountains, you enter into a deal with them. The people of Chamonix looked calmly upon death in the mountains. They even regarded it with a certain awe. Those who lost their lives on the slopes were considered heroes, and helicopters were seen flying over the town almost every day, rescuing unfortunate tourists and locals in trouble. At some point, the town administration had to ban wingsuit jumping when two daredevils crashed into some residential buildings. The sight of their bodies hitting the ground did not have such a positive effect on local tourism. However, such bans on sport were not taken well by the residents with their deep love of mountain life. It is believed that everyone who lives in Chamonix has a relative who died in the mountains. The cemetery at the foot of the mountain also had a gravestone with the name Siffredi on it. One day, when Marco was only 18 months old, his older brother Pierre went skiing and was hit by an avalanche. He was knocked down and buried under the snow. Philip and Michelle tried not to talk too much to little Marco about his lost brother. They wanted to quickly forget about the tragedy and learn to live on. But one day, when he was 6 years old, Marco saw an avalanche on TV. He pointed to the screen and whispered, "Pierre." Marco's favorite story was the fairy tale, The Little Prince, written by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. The boy recognized himself in The Little Prince. He was also fascinated by the world, a little naive, and had a taste for adventure. Later, conquering the peaks of the world with his snowboard at the ready, Marco would always carry this book in his bag. The young man, just like the little prince, didn't want to grow up. He wanted to live an interesting life full of experiences and, most importantly, mountains. When the Siffredi family opened their own campsite in the town, Marco began to work there with his parents and sister. The young man had been drawn to the mountains since he was a boy. Surrounded by the rock giants for his entire life, he naturally dreamed of conquering peaks, of adventures and expeditions. Instead of superheroes, he admired the fearless climbers on the mountain slopes around his hometown. One of these was Jean-Marc Boivin, a French extreme sportsman who was the first to ski down the highest peaks in the Alps. There was no one equal to him at that time. Marco also got interested in fishing when he was a boy. He learned absolutely everything about fish and at some point decided to dig a pond in front of the house. Philip found his son one day with a shovel in the yard. He asked what the boy was doing, to which Marco replied that he was digging a pond. As he asked Marco for more details, Philip understood that his son knew what he was doing and let him finish the job. The pond in front of the Siffredi's house would have stayed there forever if they had not decided to bury the terrible reminder. In the winter of 1994, Marco's father bought him his first snowboard. At that time, skiing was considered by young people to be fun for parents, but snowboarding and skateboarding were becoming more and more popular. Marco's classmate Philippe Ford showed him a new trend, so-called backcountry snowboarding, in which the snowboarder comes down the mountain off the official tracks. Marco fell in love with this new sport at first sight. Marco was always considered to be a bit of a wild card. He could never sit still, and he wasn't really interested in school. He was self-confident and felt at his best outdoors, in the mountains or the forest. However, just conquering peaks wasn't enough for him. He wanted something more. In 1996, Marco was a typical 90s teenager, dyed blonde hair, piercings, and a taste for American punk rock and rock and roll. The girls were all crazy for the bright guy with a gap between his teeth. Marco's sister described him as a panty dropper. But behind his boyish appearance, the young man had serious ambitions. On June 17, 1996, at 2 in the morning, Marco woke up, smoked a cigarette, took his snowboard, and set off for the mountains. What he was about to do was sheer madness. But it's even more unbelievable when you remember that he first set foot on a snowboard just a year earlier. He was going to descend the north face of the Aiguille du Midi, one of the most dangerous slopes in the Mont Blanc region. He would be the second person to do it after his hero, Jean-Marc Boivin, and the first to do it on a snowboard. Marco climbed the mountain with the future guide, Louis Lesage. Before that, the young man had not climbed together. His parents knew what he was going to do, and despite being very afraid for her son, Michel could not stop him. Marco was stubborn, especially when it came to his dreams, and going down his native mountain on a snowboard had become a dream. He studied the northern slope for several years with binoculars, trying to memorize every rock, every piece of ice. The young people reached the summit in 7 hours. Then Marco got on his snowboard and started the descent. He knew that the whole valley was watching him. He could easily be seen with binoculars. His friend René Robert, a photographer and extreme sport enthusiast, took photographs. Marco came down without unstrapping the snowboard once. He completed the descent according to the rules. He was just 17, and the news about the new star of snowboarding began to spread throughout his native Chamonix. People thought he was mad and said that he would soon be just another name in the cemetery. Perhaps they said these things because Marco did not accept the authority of the mountain guides and often spit on the rules if he knew he could do without them. Marco didn't even go to the mountains with his father. Philip often recalled how he had to force his son to do things he didn't like. When we would go on walks when he was a kid, he cried and complained the whole time, Philip said as he mimicked dragging a crying Marco along the trail by his arm. He didn't like being outside with us and didn't like hiking or climbing, so we never climbed together, and I didn't teach him. Anything he learned on his own. That was Marco. Having conquered Mont Blanc, Marco began to plan his next ascents and descents. He went to the Andes to climb Huayna Potosi, the Bolivian 6,000er, and succeeded. Then he started to think even more globally, planning even more dangerous expeditions. One mountain in particular did not let him sleep at night: Everest. Marco probably chose Everest just because nobody had ever gone down it on a snowboard before. The sport was quite new, unlike skiing, and there were still free places on the Olympus of snowboarding. When Marco told his father about his plans, Philip, who understood that there was no use in trying to stop his son, said that there was someone he should talk to. That person was a certain Russell Bryce, a mountain lover from New Zealand and the owner of a company which organized Everest expeditions. Bryce had a spotless reputation for running super safe expeditions. There had never been a single death in any of his tour groups before, even on Everest. In 1999, he received a call from Marco, who had just come back from Nepal and had now set his sights on Everest. Bryce received such calls frequently, and most of them they went nowhere. Having learned what an investment of money and effort it would be to make it to the top, most of the aspiring climbers dropped the idea. Marco and Russell decided to meet at the pub in Chamonix to talk. When he saw Marco in the flash, Russell's immediate reaction was that this would all be over very quickly. Two people approached his table, a teenager with purple hair and piercings, and a strange man whom Marco introduced as his lawyer. I don't know why Marco brought a lawyer. Maybe he thought it made him seem more serious and that I would take him more seriously, but I never saw that person again, Russ said. Marco didn't need a lawyer, he needed to convince me to take him to Everest. Chamonix is full of people like Marco, young, wild, dangerous, and many of them end up dead. But once I got past the initial shock, the studs, and the green or purple hair, or whatever color it was that day, and got to talking with Marco, there was something remarkable about this young bloke. He looked quite radical, but he was actually quite stable inside. Marco explained his plans to Bryce, not just to conquer Everest, but to come down again on a snowboard. The idea seemed incredible, but Bryce said it was doable, but only if Siffredi managed to conquer a few other 8,000ers first and come down safely. Marco didn't need long to think about it. The man made the deal then and there. For the next few years, Marco worked at the family campsite to raise money for his expeditions. He made an agreement with his parents. They would pay him in advance, and he would work it off over several years. At first, he climbed all the peaks of his native valley in the Chamonix region, then set off for the 6,000er Taclarajo in Peru with his friends Philippe Ford and René Robert, the photographer who captured his achievements. Before the trip, the mother of one of his friends gave him a small cross. It became a kind of talisman for Marco, which he wore on all of his subsequent trips. Well, almost all of them. After Peru, Siffredi went to Nepal to descend from Dorje Lakpa at a height of almost 30,000 feet. From the top, the young man had a magnificent view of the two highest peaks in the world, Shishapangma and Everest. His heart was set alight by the irresistible desire to climb them as soon as possible, in spite of Bryce's request to take things gradually. The only thing that stopped him a little in his tracks was the death of Philippe Ford in 1999. Marco's close friend lost his life in an avalanche, just like his brother. Next, Marco planned a trip to Cho Oyu, rising almost 27,000 feet above sea level. In the year 2000, he successfully made the descent on his snowboard, and now, even more confident in his own abilities, he felt ready to take on Everest. Spring 2001, the group led by Russell Bryce arrived in the Himalayas, with just a few weeks before the planned descent. Everyone in the group paid Russell $36,000. This was the money Marco had received in advance for his work at the family campsite. He worked as a manager there, selling croissants, cleaning toilets, answering guests' questions, and improving his English. In Nepal, Marco bought a sleeveless jacket for $2, which was supposedly filled with goose feathers. Bryce quickly explained that the jacket was filled with nothing but chicken feathers and was worth absolutely nothing, but the young man refused to believe him. Feathers were constantly flying out of the jacket and sticking to the rest of the group, but Marco was attached to his new purchase. His feathery sleeveless jacket gained him the nickname Ping Poulet, or Chicken Pimp. Marco quickly became friends with the locals. Most of them didn't speak English, but that didn't matter to Marco. He negotiated with them without words. The young man also became well acquainted with the Sherpas who would help the group during the ascent. He even drank beer with them and went for rides in their ox-drawn wagons.
"It's unusual,"
said 2000 team member Alan Miller of Vail, Colorado.
"I have very close Sherpa friends, and I'm friends with their wives, and I go into their homes, but not off just one expedition like that. But Marco did that with the Sherpas, and I think they were amused by him, intrigued with him. Kind of like, what's with this kid? He has these piercing blue eyes, and this shaggy blonde hair, and this big toothy grin. The word authenticity is thrown around a lot these days, but Marco had it. He was one of a kind. Marco was authentic."
Bryce recalled that one day he saw Marco entertaining the local children by tying his skateboard to a horse with a rope and riding around on it. Bryce, who already knew the bright young man well by this point, was not at all surprised. He just grinned. At the Everest base camp, Marco studied the slopes with binoculars, trying to plot a route. The young snowboarder was bored. While the rest of the group were slowly acclimatizing, he felt ready to go to the top already. Each evening he sat in his tent, reading The Little Prince and listening to American rap, which he couldn't really understand. He was shocked when the group told him how many swear words his favorite lyrics contained. On one occasion, a piece of popcorn got stuck in Marco's teeth, which caused inflammation in his gums. Marco refused to accept any help. At the mere mention of pain, he started to tremble. Eventually, the pain passed, but the event stayed in the group's mind. In spite of his outstanding sporting achievements, it turned out that Marco started crying like a baby if he had any health problems. Marco also had a girlfriend during this time, Stephanie. He was constantly on the phone with her, spending enormous amounts of money on calls from his satellite phone. In May 2001, Marco and the Himalayan Expeditions Company were making the final preparations to climb the world's highest peak. A few days earlier, another snowboarder set off for the summit, Dr. Stefan Gott from Austria. Now it appeared that Marco and Stefan were competing for the first place in the record books. The bets were on who would make it down first. Gott made the climb without help from Sherpas and without extra oxygen, making the already daunting ascent even more of a challenge. A few days before Marco's departure, the Sherpas performed a ritual puja offering to the gods. Marco had nothing to offer the deities except his snowboard, which he placed upon the rocks, hoping that the local spirits would have mercy on him. The young man was an atheist, but was known to treat other beliefs with respect. He hoped to reach the summit and then descend via the Hornbein Couloir, but when he began the climb, it became clear that there was almost no snow on the slopes. It was spring, the weather was clear, and the snow that covered Everest at other times of the year had melted in the sun. The plan to come down the Hornbein Couloir had to be abandoned, but there was a plan B, the Norton Couloir, which seemed to still have enough snow in it. Marco faced another challenge in the early stages of his ascent. He heard the news that Dr. Stefan Gott had successfully reached the bottom of his snowboard, which completely discouraged him. He even started thinking about going home now that everything was lost. However, he soon learned that Gott had unstrapped his snowboard during one of the sections of the descent, which disqualified him. Marco still had a chance. Finally, on May 23rd, the day after his 22nd birthday, donning his cross talisman, Marco reached the top of the world. The extreme cold at the summit caused the bindings on his snowboard to crack, but fortunately, one of the Sherpas was able to fix it with a rescue wire. Marco took his bearings and focused. The time had come. He took a deep breath and jumped into the abyss. His board raced down the 45-degree slope of the couloir. The first 5,900 feet flew by as he skillfully maneuvered around other climbers making their way up. He stopped for an hour to regain his breath and gather strength for the next challenge. Then he set off again and passed the rest of the route to the base camp just as successfully. In total, it took him 4 hours to reach the base camp from the summit without unstrapping his board once. News about the young snowboarding genius spread like wildfire all over the planet, sent from the camp using a satellite phone. Marco was the first person in world history to snowboard down Mount Everest. He was only 22 years old and had already reached the pinnacle of his sporting career. Once back at the camp, Marco ate pizza, washed it down with a few drinks, and celebrated his achievement with high fives all around. He was euphoric. "Marco, you can't live on the edge for too much longer before falling off," said West, one of the members of the expedition, to Marco that evening. His words would soon prove prophetic. Some people thought that Marco should not be awarded the world record because he used oxygen during both the ascent and the descent, but nevertheless, the record was recognized as his. Despite his incredible success, Marco was not satisfied. He was still obsessed with the idea of coming down the Hornbein Couloir, named after Tom Hornbein, who climbed it in 1963. This couloir was considered more dangerous and less predictable. The young man would not settle for the easy option, thus securing his record for all time. The timing would have to be right. He would have to wait for the couloir to be covered in snow, and he would have to raise the funds somehow. Marco went to Shishapangma again in the autumn of 2001 as preparation, but he couldn't snowboard due to strong winds. Then, Marco, Russell Bryce, and two Sherpas, Ferba and Lapasang Temba, spent the following summer in Chamonix planning the second ascent. Logistics, finances, and the threat of fatal failure constantly slowed the team down, but the young daredevil didn't listen to anyone. His mind was set on another showdown with the mountain. This time, he needed even more money, as much as $50,000, which of course he didn't have. He didn't even have sponsors except for his parents. He didn't know how to sell himself, and all the sponsors thought he was too weird with his piercings and colored hair. Nobody was willing to promote his adventures. In the end, Philip Siffredi gave in. He realized that his son would never stop dreaming about the idea. Bryce promised to give Marco the most experienced climbers to go with him. The young snowboarder's father made the decision to give him $50,000 up front. Generous dad. A few days before departing for the Himalayas, Marco told a friend that maybe he would marry his girlfriend and settle down in Chamonix after his return. Unfortunately, this dream would remain just that, a dream. On August 8, 2002, Marco left Chamonix for the last time. This time, he forgot his Lucky Cross talisman at home, but after all, he wasn't a religious person, so he continued on his way. Arriving in Kathmandu, he met the three Sherpas who would take him to the top this time. Along with the Sherpas, Marco would take a guide, Olivier Besson. This year, Russell Bryce would not be with the group. He was managing other climbs in the Himalayas. On the plus side, there was a lot of snow at the summit this year. Perhaps the mountain would be kinder to mistakes than the year before. Siffredi started to acclimatize, getting higher and higher to the peak of his dreams. On August 14th, he got into a jeep which would take him and his companions to the base camp. That same morning, the Sherpas performed the Buddhist rite of puja, praying to the spirits and asking them for good luck on the expedition. They used food, drink, and incense as offerings. Marco studied Everest's northern face through a telescope. It seemed that there was enough snow for the descent, but every now and then he could see small avalanches breaking out. He would need to give the snow time to stabilize before starting the final climb. The group spent several days at the base camp acclimatizing. On August 20th, yaks were brought to the base camp. They would bring the equipment, food, and everything else necessary to the next camp, located higher up the mountain. Most of the climbers on Everest come in the spring before the rainy season, so at this time, the high-altitude camp was almost completely empty. Marco specifically chose the end of summer because the snow was deeper and more suitable for snowboarding. Marco was again impatient to start the final ascent. He urged the others to start moving, as if forgetting the importance of acclimatization. This year, Marco was the leader of the group. Russell Bryce had no other clients on Everest at this time, so Marco would have to climb alone. On August 23rd, Marco described Everest as an avalanche festival, and now the route he had planned to come down turned out to be completely bare because of the constant avalanches and wind. The snow disappeared, revealing the sharp stones beneath. Siffredi phoned an acquaintance, Jan Gissendanner, a meteorologist in Chamonix, as well as his girlfriend Stephanie and his parents, the phone bill came to $2,000. Marco felt quite lonely. In the camp, there was only him, the Sherpas, and the snow. The altitude was very intense. He had a headache every day and possibly developed altitude sickness. On August 28th, Marco and the Sherpas made a first excursion to the bivouacs on the northern side. On the way back, Marco came down on his snowboard and the Sherpas filmed him. Here are the shots. The weather was unpredictable. During the night, a snowstorm passed across the mountain. Marco and the Sherpas spent the next few days discussing plans and making constant phone calls to Jan Gissendaner. The weather changed every day. On Wednesday, September 4th, Gissendaner suggested that Sunday the 8th would be perfect weather. Marco believed him and planned to start climbing on the Friday. Friday the 6th turned out to be a fine day. A bright sun shined in a big blue sky over Everest. Marco called his parents and told them he was still in the lower camp. He didn't want them to worry about him spending so much time at high altitude, struggling with altitude sickness and daily headaches. On Saturday the 7th, Marco and the Sherpas climbed over 26,000 feet, or 8,000 meters, and entered so-called death zone, where the human body slowly dies. Gissendaner called Marco again and told him to make the descent as quickly as possible without any delays. That evening, the weather was predicted to deteriorate, and nobody could say for certain what the situation would be like on Sunday.
You won't have many chances.
Okay, merci. Adieu, Jan.
Yeah, we'll talk tomorrow, Marco. Call me when you're down.
Yes, but adieu, Jan. Adieu. The usual way to say goodbye in French is au revoir, see you soon. Adieu is normally only used as a final farewell when people are not expecting to meet again. Did Marco know that he would never talk to Jan again? Did he sense the impending danger? Gissendaner recalled later that Marco's farewell seemed strange to him and even frightened him a little. The battery in Marco's satellite phone was slowly dying. He decided to call his friend, Bertrand Delapierre, who besides the Sherpas became the last person to hear Marco's voice. Bertrand, I'm so close to the hornbeam I could touch it. It's right here. The snow is great. I feel strong. The phone finally died after this call. Marco and the Sherpas found themselves all alone in one of the deadliest places on Earth. On Sunday, September 8th, at 1:30 in the morning, the group began the final push to the summit. They were up to their chests in snow, and it was almost impossible to walk in it. The Sherpas worked hard digging out a path, trying their best to bring Marco to the peak. At 2 in the afternoon, the group finally reached the top of Everest, Chomolungma, the mother goddess, the highest point on planet Earth. The journey took 3 times longer than the first time. Later, Russell Bryce would call even the ascent itself a remarkable achievement, despite what happened next. Ferba Sherpa, Marco's friend, was the first one on the summit and was waiting for the snowboarder, meeting him with a smile. Where are we?
At the summit, but tired,
replies Marco. Ferba does a little dance.
Summit.
Tired, too much snow, too much climbing. Marco was not particularly happy to be at the top. He realized how difficult it would be to come down. Below, they could see the clouds thickening. The Sherpas understood that a storm was probably on its way and it was getting late, already 3 in the afternoon. They tried to convince Marco not to go down on the snowboard, but he wouldn't listen. He'd been waiting for this moment for 1.5 years. He replaced his oxygen tank and was ready to go. In his backpack, just 3 liters of water, oxygen, and a rope.
Take care, Marco,
wishes Ferba. Okay, Ferba. See you tomorrow. The last time the Sherpas saw Marco was at 3:15. He waited to see them off and then quickly sped off on his board. The Sherpas wasted no time in coming down as quickly as possible as the storm was rapidly brewing. At that moment in Chamonix, Marco's parents were getting ready to visit relatives on the Italian side. On the same day, competitions were taking place in the town, and the news that Marco Siffredi had reached the top quickly spread around. Everyone was proud of the snowboarder and celebrated. After 2001, Marco was respected even by those who had laughed at him before. The people of Chamonix believed that since he reached the top, he must have already come down. The ascent has always been considered the most challenging part of the journey. However, when they learned that Marco had made it to the top, his parents started to worry. The time difference between Nepal and France was quite significant, which meant that Marco should have already reached the bottom. But there was no call, no joyous voice on the phone. "My wife was very worried," Philip said. "After Pierre, my wife didn't want it to happen a second time. 1 was too much, 2 would be impossible." From the base camp, Olivier Besson watched Marco's descent. He saw the young man as he set off, but since Marco had no means of communication, he could not confirm whether he had reached the yak shepherd who was preparing camp for the young man. Besson just had to hope for the best. By this point, the Sherpas had almost reached the third camp below the summit. 43,000 feet away, in the camp itself, they saw a man's silhouette. They got angry because he didn't turn on a light for them. At first, they thought that Olivier Besson was in the camp, but they soon realized it must be someone else. But who? There was no one on the slope that day except the 3 of them and Marco, who according to their calculations should have been much lower by now. Reaching the camp, the Sherpas were even more shocked. There were no traces that anybody had been here, but they all still saw a figure on the slope. The Sherpas interpreted this in their own way, based on their traditions. Perhaps Marco had not come down and they were seeing his spirit. When the Sherpas reached base camp, everyone there was already talking about how the young snowboarder had not come down. He did not return on September 8th as planned, nor on September 9th or 10th. On September 10th, Olivier Besson left the base camp. He understood that the brave young man was probably no longer among the living. When the news reached Chamonix, Marco's parents and friends immediately realized that they would never see the young man alive again. Surviving 1 night on Everest is already an impossible task. 2 or 3 is a death sentence. 12 hours later, with no news, I knew he was dead, said photographer René Robert. Bertrand Delapierre, the last person to speak to Marco, could not think of any technical reason for his friend's disappearance. Marco was a great snowboarder, he was highly skilled on the board and knew exactly what he was doing. In addition, it was clear from the binoculars that the snow where the snowboard tracks ended was light and suitable for descent. But even the Sherpas had a hard time that day, both going up and coming down. Russell Bryce, having learned about Marco's disappearance, immediately went to look for him. Marco had been wearing a yellow jumpsuit easily visible in the snow. Week after week passed, but neither Marco's body nor his snowboard was found. There were no crevasses or abysses where his trail ended, nowhere for him to fall or disappear. Looking for Marco, Russell, who by this point had become almost a second father to the young man, found only piles of snow and ice. A month after his disappearance, a ceremony was held at Everest Base Camp in memory of Marco. His friends and relatives were there, his girlfriend Stephanie, and a huge number of Sherpas who together with the monks sang traditional Buddhist prayers. The weather was gloomy. Clouds hung over the procession as if they knew why everyone had gathered. However, after some time, the clouds parted, revealing a brilliant blue sky, and along with it, the traces of Marco's descent over 27,000 feet above the heads of the mourners. The snow had still not completely covered them. The Siffredi family spent several weeks in Nepal, retracing every one of their beloved son's steps. The only one who didn't go to the Himalayas was Shruti, his sister, who at that time was pregnant with her first child.
I didn't tell him I was pregnant, and I didn't want to tell him because I didn't want him to worry, so he could focus on Everest, the North Face. But he knew, and he was happy. When I heard that Marco disappeared, I forgot about my baby for like 3 weeks, until my family left for Tibet, and I felt like I had freezing water on top of my head. I always told myself that Marco will never die, because my parents cannot lose 2 children.
8 months after Marco's disappearance, a Russian group led by Yuri Koshelenko found a snowboard near the third camp. The climbing community celebrated at the discovery, hoping that the board belonged to Marco, but it turned out that it didn't. The snowboard Koshelenko found was purple, while Marco's board was black, so the riddle remained unsolved. Marco's body was never found. Most of the people who lose their lives on Everest rest there forever. There were no mass searches. The endless snows of Everest seemed to have swallowed up the young brave snowboarder. Marco's parents understood that they might never find their son.
"We never thought he would be found," Philip Siffredi said. "I know it is too difficult. The mountain is too big, too harsh, the conditions too cold. One night in those conditions and you're finished. And I know it's not possible for man to look for another man, and it is even more difficult to bring another man down."
There are several versions of what happened on September 8, 2002. Philip Siffredi believes that his son sat down to rest on the slope, tired from the exhausting 12-hour climb, fell asleep and froze in the snow, never to wake up again. A fall seems to be the most probable explanation due to the fact that Marco's footprints seem to just vanish for no reason at all. Another version is that Marco's life was taken from him by an avalanche, a frequent occurrence on Everest. He saw them himself just a few days before the ascent. They could be quite weak, which is why the Sherpas didn't notice it, but deadly enough to sweep away a lone snowboarder. Another theory explains that Marco could have fallen into one of the ice crevasses found all over Everest and the glacier below the summit. His body could not be seen from the base camp, which supports this idea, but Everest explorer Elizabeth Hawley believes that there were no crevasses or faults along the route that Marco took. This leaves only the theories about his fatigue or a small avalanche. Yet another version says that Marco's body was lost somewhere among the rocks covering the summit, obscuring his yellow jumpsuit from the view of other climbers, the Sherpas and Russell Bryce. However, in the years since his disappearance, it would appear that all of the rocks have been examined, if not up close, then with the help of binoculars. No bright jumpsuit or black snowboard have ever been seen. The strangest version of events, however, was given by Marco's sister Shruti, who believes that the young man in fact came down the mountain safely, but then decided not to return to civilization, preferring to stay with the yak shepherds somewhere around Mount Everest. According to this version, he's still out there somewhere, hiking the wild peaks, becoming one with the mountains. Of course, there is no evidence to support this version, but it's nice to imagine. Russell Bryce considers this version highly improbable. The locals all know each other, and a bright youngster with a big toothy smile would definitely not go unnoticed. What's more, Marco adored his family and was a real mama's boy. He would never leave Michelle alone deliberately. Some people did not recognize Marco Siffredi's achievement to be the first person to descend from Everest on a snowboard because of the fact that he used oxygen tanks. Everest snobs attribute the record to another Frenchman, Cyril Destremaux, who made the descent in 1998 but walked a section on foot. He took 2 entire days to come down. However, the facts are facts. The first snowboarder to descend from the highest point on Earth on a snowboard is still considered to be Marco, the young daredevil who flirted with fate. Perhaps if he had settled with his first success and just come down with the Sherpas the second time, he would have survived. But this was a person who thought that adventure and danger make life worth living. There was one more dream that Marco did achieve, apart from conquering the world's highest mountain. His name became a legend throughout his hometown, where the people felt that he embodied the spirit of Chamonix. But his detractors were also right. A memorial plaque with his name appeared in the town cemetery next to where his older brother was buried. And yes, the date on the gravestone is heartbreaking. He was only 23. Usually, climbers die in places where they can be easily found and identified by their bright clothes. Of the 300 people who have died on Everest, only about a dozen are still missing. In 2018, the Siffredi family campsite was closed, but the pain of loss has stayed with the family forever, a wound that can never be closed. Valerie, Marco's older sister, described her feelings perhaps better than anyone else.
We are a religious family, but once Marco was gone, I told myself there is no God. I told myself that it's not possible for there to be a God. If there is one, then God is not good. No God would take Marco away, not after what happened with Pierre. Both of my parents' sons were taken by the mountains. Both of my brothers were taken by the mountains. The mountains are not fair. There is no closure. There is only pain. My mother is destroyed. My father is destroyed. What parent wouldn't want to know where their son's body is? My parents still want to know what happened to Marco.
A few years later, when asked who bought Marco his first snowboard, Philip answered,
Maybe that is the reason that he's dead, because I always paid for everything. It is not good to buy your kids everything.
On Everest slopes, the Siffredi family lost their second son. According to some versions, the cause of death was the same as their eldest, an avalanche, mercilessly sweeping away the young life. Or is Marco still alive, quietly herding yaks somewhere in the wilds of Nepal? We will probably never know for sure, and Marco's body will remain forever on the icy peak, along with his trusty black snowboard. Please feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story interesting, subscribe to my channel where you can find many more gripping and tragic stories. And as always, stay safe.